Insert disc 2.
Aaron, I want you to tell me about comic books.
Oh, yes. I remember a time when I read comic books every day.
When you were a kid, did you ever, when you were like, I would say between the ages of 6 and 10, were there any comics in your life?
No.
So like
Well,
you never...
that's not true. I did read, I had forgotten about this, Boatster, but you stirred up an old memory. When I was a young lad, I did read comics, but they were not Marvel comics or even hero comics. I used to read Harvey comics, they made Richie Rich.
Oh, yeah.
I used to read Richie Rich a ton. I read all the digests. Mom would pick them up at the grocery store, and I would read these things quite a bit. And it's funny, I remember the day I stopped reading them. I was like...
was it when the Richie Rich movie came out starring Macaulay Culkin?
Oh, no, it was way before that. No, I think I was probably coming up in my teens, maybe 11 or 12. And I remember reading this thing, and I remember thinking to myself, my God, this is just the same old shtick week after week. And also, this guy makes me mad. Well, he's got all this money, he's look at all this stuff. And I remember it was like, I'm done with this.
That was it.
And I was it. Richie Rich was done, and I didn't read comics again for another... 17 years, something like that, 16 years. And then I didn't grow up reading Marvel, but I knew about them.
You didn't really grow up in a very superhero-saturated environment. Comic book heroes were kind of on a downswing in your formative years.
They were. In my formative years, they weren't. In the 70s, they were going pretty well. But in the 80s, they did drop off. I had friends that were into them. Hose was always a big comic book fan, and he would tell me what was going on in them. And I was always like, man, that sounds pretty interesting, but I could never catch up with this stuff. And comic books, they go on forever, And then when I graduated from electronics school and moved to Lexington, Kentucky, I didn't know anyone except for my roommate, and I had met a couple people on the BBSs, but not really hang out with them. So it just so happens that our apartment was right across the street from a comic book store. And I would have nothing but time and money because those were the days.
Yeah.
And I would go across there, and I was looking at the books. I was like, maybe I should get into a book. And I saw that the Age of Apocalypse was coming out. This would have been 1993.
And so this is right at the height of comic books just in general mainstream parlance, because that was the same year as the death of Superman and all of this stuff going on. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
You got a good memory. I don't remember. I remember seeing all that stuff, but I was like, I knew I was a Marvel guy.
You've always been more attracted to that side of things.
Yeah. And I thought, X-Men are cool. I used to watch the cartoon, and I thought, I'm gonna get this. I'm gonna collect the entire Age of Apocalypse crossover, which they took all the comics that were regular monthly comics, and they all turned them into one big huge adventure. And I bet there were 60 comics in it. It was a huge. I've still got them, but it was a huge crossover, and I collected them all. And then that sort of kicked me off, and I was collecting comics after that, and I collected them all the way up until about, I want to say, 99, 2000, something like that. And then they did a crossover I hated, where all the non-mutants on Earth were effectively killed or banished to another dimension or something like that. And I didn't like the direction that comics were going. And they'd also gotten more expensive, and I was cheap. And eventually, that was
what year was that?
I want to think it was in the late 90s. So I was only really heavily collecting comics for that 6-year run. Now, that doesn't mean I stopped being interested, because along the way I found out that my talents as a computer repair guy could get me some comics. And I built some comics for a friend of mine, and he gave me his whole collection, which was a ton of X-Men. I think I've got every X-Men from 100 to the end of the first volume, and I've got probably about 30 or so from 1 to 100, and I've got all the Avengers from 99 until the end of the first volume, and I've probably got about 50 or 60 of the ones below 100, the real old ones, the vintage Silver Age stuff. And then another one of my buddies was getting married. He got rid of his collection, so I got a bunch of more of Avengers from him. And then I bought, my good buddy Chad, old Chad. I picked up a ton of comics from him. He was just getting out of it. He had tried to cash in on comics, and
it rarely ends well when you try and cash in. Yeah.
Poorly. I remember he had when Todd McFarlane realigned Spider-Man, and it had all these different types of covers.
Oh, I remember that.
Chad bought. Chad was an interesting fellow. He bought 5 of each color of the first issue, and then 10 of the second issue. He's like, "This is gonna be the one that's gonna be valuable because no one's gonna collect it." Well, it ain't worth jack. And he was giving those things out for years. They were around forever. I tried the same thing when the Avengers movie came out. I bought, or it might have been the X-Men. It was the X-Men movie. When the X-Men movie came out, I bought a box of the movie issue that they were giving out at the theater. And then I thought, I'm going to sell these off and make some bucks. I think I may have broke even, but I've still got them. I gave them out for years as gifts. For years, because I had a stack of them. So collecting comics for monetary gain is a fool's errand. And it's something I never really thought much about doing. Although I do look up what they're worth now occasionally to see what they're doing. When the Avengers movie came out, my collection went up substantially in value because those became more interesting to people.
Yeah. Now, being a Marvel guy, I guess you never really had any interest in any of the Golden Age stuff, right?
It's interesting. Chad lent me a collection of old, I want to think it was Supermans, and I read those, and they were pretty entertaining.
These were not originals.
These were wacky. That was a collected book of volumes, And Batman, same thing. You go back and listen to those. Watch those old. They're kind of wacky. I like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm reading a book on the history of Batman right now, and they've included in the book several full issues from each one of the periods. And the Golden Age stuff is it's drawn so much differently than comics are drawn now. Everything is so much more plain because they were so much more limited with what they could do. But I really dig it. I think it's a cool style. But I mean, there's no way that you can afford that stuff these days.
I go. Do you look at you never collected comics, I'm guessing?
No, I never got into it, but I was sort of vicariously involved because my friend Chad is he's been a big comics guy for a long time.
If you go into a comic book store today, which I do on occasion, I'm usually looking for vintage gaming stuff, but sometimes I'll look through the comics. The art and the art, the craftsmanship that has gone into the actual artistic parts of these things is off the charts. It's off the charts. Now, I'm guessing that's because of you have computers to use as a tool. But, I mean, the quality of the art is unbelievable. And they're on great paper and everything, but they're so expensive.
Right.
I just cannot. I tried to get back into, I remember when Alpha Flight relaunched 12 years ago. I tried to get back into
What's Alpha Flight?
Alpha Flight was a Canadian superhero team of mutants. I don't know. They go through and change stuff, and it makes me unhappy. My buddy Hose and me went to Comic-Con in Charlotte. Gosh, that was probably 10, 12 years ago. And we went to a panel of old comic book writers, including the guy that drew the original Green Lanterns. And some real famous guys. And all they did the whole time was talk about how much they hated modern comics. So we loved it. Then we went to the press conference where they were just launching Civil War, the Marvel series, the movie that was released recently. Yeah. And I hated the concept. I was like, this is horrible. These concepts are coming up with. But, they printed money with it for a while. But, I mean, I think it was detrimental. I don't think they were creating too many new fans, and a lot of the old fans are dying or giving up. Because I just read the other day that comic book sales are waning, and they're turning towards more of a digital model, which I never thought the digital model was going to work because there's nothing there. You have to have a tangible, collectible item. That's part of what comics are. If you're just reading it for the story, that's great. You can get the digital subscription, but I could never fathom getting that.
Well, again, this is just showing your age. There's people that collect Steam games, and they talk about it as if it's a physical collection.
Well, when someone unplugs Steam, you're boned. I mean, they're not going to unplug Marvel. I've got the tangible
Somebody burns down your house, you're boned.
I can go recollect them. I mean, I'm just saying, I don't see to me, now if you're reading them just because you like the story, and that's part of it.
I mean, you should be primarily.
No, I don't.
You like the thought of just having,
there's a tangible
thousands of long boxes in a closet?
I find pleasure in my comics, actually physically holding them, opening them up, displaying them, and also looking through them. You can look through them and you can see stuff you hadn't thought about for a while. Or I remember what happened in this issue. I have a reading collection, which means I have read pretty much all of them at least once, and probably some of them many times. I enjoy it. I find pleasure. I've toted these things up a mountain. I've toted them back and forth to Lexington, up and down a mountain, and back and forth. Since then, I've never. The thought of abandoning them. I got rid of my arcade games, and I didn't get rid of my comic books. And I've never, as pinched as I've been for money over the years, and it's been. I've told you tales of how tight.
So really, the comic books would be the very last thing to go.
Yeah, and and one thing you'll probably get to this eventually. When you have a son, and we've talked this before, it's an excuse to collect stuff because, and since I already had this collection, my thought is, this is going to be Luke's someday. I'm going to give this entire collection to Luke, and let him treasure it or not, But it gives me plenty of reason that I didn't even need anyway to keep it. And Luke, I have him reading some comics now, and sometimes we'll go through them, every once in a while, so he can I want to start getting him into it a little bit, so he can appreciate what the comics are, the art form of comic books. It sounds hokey, but it's true.
Well, no, I don't think there's anything hokey about that.
The joy you can derive from it. I mean, we're living in a digital world, and comics or books in general are almost a throwback, to obviously a simpler, less digital age. And why I have no problem with people collecting comics or reading comics online. Hey, I do it. I've got a bunch of digital books, but I wouldn't call that a collection. I would call that something you can just conveniently read. Mm-hmm. Just like emulators. I mean, I can emulate almost all the systems that I have, but there's something, and this. There's something about having that system, and putting that cartridge in and using the controller.
This is the thing with me with comic books. Because I'm a big book collector. I've got a lot of books, and I take pride in my books. And I did the same feelings that you get when you open up a comic, I get when I open up one of my books. Comic books are thin, and they're not easily stored. Like, one of the things that I like about collecting books is I like looking at my bookshelf.
Yes.
I like looking and seeing the spines and the different colors and the different sizes.
Sure.
It's difficult to do that with comic books.
Well, you're right. And I came up with the best solution I could, which is, and you've seen it, I found these snapped together plastic display sleeves, and snapped together about 6 rows of 8 or something like that, and then took my best comics and some of my favorite ones and stuck them in there. And so I'm thinking now comics as an art piece, because the one thing you're right about is when you stick these, I've got my comics in a long boxes in my closet, which is almost, I can't even get to it. And it was always bothering me. We've talked about having stuff that you keep that you don't ever use, which is one of the things I like about this show and ARG is I'm breaking out all this old stuff and playing with it. But the comics were just inaccessible, and they were just sitting there. And I'm like, man, I've got all these beautiful treasures that I can't enjoy or look at. And so now that I've done that, I love it. I wish I could put up more of those things.
Yeah. Of course, the one downfall of that is that with a book, you see it on the shelf, you want to read it, you go up and you take the book off the shelf.
That's true. You're right. And you're talking to someone who has a collection of books in his house,
you've got
the likes of which no one has ever. It's like a library. Mm-hmm. And she's got, Teresa, my girlfriend, collects paranormal history and old yearbooks and stuff like that. She's into that stuff, and I would put her collection of paranormal and ghost stories up against anyone around, and I would put it up against any library.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's no one that's going to come close, including real rare stuff, including stuff that, So I got some stuff from the UK, from one of our buddies, and so. I've got a ton of books in there, and you're right. The downside of books is, and I will say the long boxes are sort of a pain, but when you've got that, we've got so many books, I'm worried about our floor. I mean, it's a bunch of heavy books, and just shelf after shelf after shelf. And the thing is, there are plenty of books to get right now because people are just getting rid of them.
Right.
And eventually, and I tell her, I'm like, listen, one of these days, you know, people are just going to do away with books because they're just so unyielding. It's much like comics. There'll be a day where they're just like, why are we wasting paper on this? Because it is sort of stupid in a way when you can just pick up your Kindle or whatever and flip through them. I mean, much like myself, I'm sure you pick up a book off the shelf and just look through it. And there's the tactile pleasure of flipping the pages. But I have a feeling there won't be too many more generations that do that. I don't think it's going to be like a Twilight Zone episode where they're like, oh, this is the last book on Earth or something. But I mean, I can see a day where there's, you know, they're going to get rid of a lot of these things because in a lot of ways, it's a waste of space, it's a waste of material, and it's sort of pointless. You know, but it's going to suck for us.
It'll just become more and more of a niche thing.
Yes, sort of like LPs.
Yeah, right. And then it'll start, you know, and who knows, it might
it'll come back.
Yeah,
you know, and look at cartridges. People, I mean, I read all the time where you could have got these cartridges for. I mean, I remember going to KB Toys when they were blowing out in '84. Cartridges. I mean, they were giving them to you with everything. They were just huge bins of open cartridges or boxed games. I mean, you could have picked up 50 of them and take them out of there for probably $10. You know, and now those same games are going for a mint.
Right.
You know, so. I mean, we were talking me and Brent were talking. Heck, on when the Vectrix was going under, you could buy those at the end for $50. You know, $50.
Unbelievable.
You know, or so it's a come and go sort of thing, and I think you're probably right. Probably not in our lifetime, but sometime in the future, people will be looking for these books. I mean, there's already a book community that's really looking for the hard to find stuff, but you know, as stuff gets harder to find,
and there's still a lot of, like, I'm interested in a lot of small publishers that do really good work, you know, with binding and things like that.
Yeah.
But again, you know, the days of going to having lots of places like Books A Million and Barnes and Noble and stuff like that, those will start to fade. And already now, when you go to Books A Million here at the mall, half the store is a coffee shop and board games and CDs and stuff like that.
And toys.
Right,
You're
toys.
right. I mean, it's not. I mean, if you go to there's a big bookseller in Lexington called Joseph Beth, a massive joint. I always wonder how many days it's got left, just for that reason. I mean, they've also got a coffee shop and they bring in musical guests or whatever. I mean, you can't just be a bookstore anymore.
Yeah.
You can, but it's not easy.
It's much like an arcade. You know, you can't just have an arcade anymore.
It is a tragedy. Man.
Yeah.